Hello, this is Nishant Malhotra from the Mill Road. Welcome to another riveting podcast. In this podcast episode, I discuss the finer points of marketing, messaging, and mission statement for enabling social change and impact within the sustainable development sector. I invite Erica Mills Barnhart, founder of Claxon Marketing and Claxon University. Erica Mills is an internationally recognized expert on how to use words to make the world a better place. Hello, Erica. Great to have you on board for another informative and insightful podcast from the Middle Road.
Hi, it's so great to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me on the show.
Before we begin our journey, a brief introduction of Erica Mills. Erica wears many hats, that of a consultant, professor, speaker, and researcher. She works with purpose-driven organizations, significantly non-profits, foundations, in amplifying their work through marketing, messaging, and fine-tuning their mission statement. A pioneer in understanding the impact of language used within the social sector, Erica Mills is a podcast host and inventor of the Wordier, an online tool to accelerate better usage of words for articulating communication for the greater good. Her 1-2-3 marketing tree and Claxon method have been used effectively by numerous mission-driven organizations with measurable impact. Erica, the first question. Let's begin your journey with your academic journey. You are a professor at Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, the University of Washington at Seattle. You have worked at multiple universities in the US and with the University of British Columbia. How would you explain the transformation within the development sector, focusing on nonprofits, philanthropy, and social innovation in your more than 2 decades of experience?
Let me ask a clarifying question if I can, because I just want to make sure that we're using the term development sector in the same way. So when you say development sector, what are you referring to?
So I'm referring to not only nonprofits, I'm referring to, it could be academics, it could also be all the actors, it could be economic development when you're looking at the public sector. So, the whole.
Okay. Because in the US, often the development sector refers specifically to international development. But what I'm hearing you say is what we might refer to as the social impact sector, or kind of the broader landscape of agents and people and organizations who want to make an impact in the world and want to make it a better place. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's precisely. I mean, you'll have foundations, everything, social impact, driven CSR, it could be CSR activities within the.
Thank you. Words are kind of my passion, so I like to clarify them before I try answering the question, lest I answer the wrong question. I think we're at such a unique, peculiar, and exciting point in time. We're coming out of a pandemic. I say optimistically that we're coming out of a global pandemic, unlike any we've seen. So many things have changed. And among the darkness, because there's been a lot of darkness, a lot of trauma, a lot of things that are hard, I would say there are some bright spots. And some of those for me are seeing how people, even folks who, aren't necessarily what we would consider like in a position to be charitable. I think there's just such a yearning to help, to contribute to making the world a better place right now, because it feels so dark and they want to bring light. This is my interpretation, not based on research per se. Although I will say, so I am an associate teaching professor at the University of Washington, where I also co-direct the Nancy Bell Evans Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy. And last fall, we released a report about the impact of COVID on nonprofits in Washington State. And even though it was specific to Washington State, they really did mirror what colleagues around the country are finding. And a lot of it is really startling. Nonprofits are hurting really, really deeply. And also what we're finding is funding is not keeping up with demand. Demand is just still far outpacing funding. However, there were some glimmers of hope from year-end fundraising. And one of the really bright spots was being reminded yet again of how innovative nonprofits are and really a trend in ways that we haven't seen before in partnership between nonprofits, between nonprofits in the private sector, between nonprofits and philanthropy, between philanthropy and the private sector, all partnerships, bilateral, multilateral, all sorts of different directions, and in really truly different ways. And then as sort of a sub point to that, but something I really want to put on people's radar, because it's heartening in terms of, those of us who are focused and dedicated to social justice, is, at least in the United States, the development sector is predominantly white and in leadership positions, right? And so one of the things we are seeing is sort of white-led organizations turning to our colleagues of color and saying, you know best. You know best. The pandemic is disproportionately and negatively impacting the communities you're serving, and you know best. How can we support? And that's a really dramatic shift in terms of power dynamics. I mean, maybe it's not dramatic yet. Maybe that's the optimist in me coming out. But it was at least, I can say as a researcher, notable and heartening. So, it's almost tough to look back 2 decades. I mean, I can reference. If I think about it, two decades ago, I was working for an organization called NPower, which was born out of Microsoft Philanthropies. And our focus was on getting technology know-how into the hands of nonprofits. When I think back to that time and I think about how, nonprofits were using technology, we were doing things like, just crazy things like hooking up multiple computers to one printer. And that was just game changing and terrifying and all sorts of things. And now, of course, we don't blink an eye at that. Of course, that would be expected, and you would be able to do it, remotely. And so much progress has been made in so many ways, and yet, we're almost exactly in the same spot that we were in terms of things like funding and. So, it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. Do I think we've made progress in the past 2 decades on balance? Yes. And I think that there are some structural dynamics that are still in place that preclude the sector from really reaching its full potential.
That's a wonderful, perspective. But thinking about it, Seattle is a tech-oriented hub. Don't you think it's much more cosmopolitan, maybe? And the change which you're talking about, do you think sort of this has happened across board in the US, or it's in coastal towns?
Oh, that is such a good question. Thank you. I mean, sometimes because I'm living and breathing Seattle-ness, where we have Microsoft and Amazon and all sorts of big tech companies. I think that we definitely, skew towards a more tech-savvy nonprofit sector, and I also, Seattle in the grand scheme of things is small, right? We're still sort of backwater in a lot of ways, and folks on the East Coast are like, right, Seattle, Washington State, right. So in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I would say organizations in rural areas find themselves in a very different position than those that are in, more metropolitan areas. It's a really fair point.
Now, I'm really very keen to understand policy making, how policy making can accelerate social innovation and philanthropy through better messaging of mission and vision of nonprofits. Now, the reason why I'm coming to this question is because I myself have a master's degree in public administration from Jared Ford School of Public Policy, University of Michigan. You have done so much. You have been a master in terms of qualitative effects, I would say, of not only using words, how you can make a social impact. So I think you are the best expert to ask how can we focus on, qualitative aspects of policy making, especially for nonprofits.
So when you say qualitative aspects,
it's like using the right words to communicate. It could be other aspects, but very specifically here, the question would be how you can use better grammar, better linguistic.
Okay, great. Because what I was sitting here thinking is, I don't know that I'm qualified to speak broadly on qualitative aspects because those could take so many shapes. But I can really talk a lot about words specifically. Yes, so messaging. So, what I find time and time again, and what keeps me so intrigued and excited about this work is that, and I'm going to use the term nonprofits really loosely here, to also include foundations. Folks who are drawn to this work are drawn to it because of the impact they can have. They are drawn to the mission. They are drawn to the vision. Very few people come from a marketing background. Super, super unusual. I mean, you asked in the previous question, one of the developments over the past 20 years, 20 years ago, the term nonprofit marketing, those two words together was like sacrilege. I mean, you almost just never heard that. And now it's like, sure, nonprofit marketing. Okay. But it is still the case that there are very few folks in the sector, working for the sector, even volunteering for the sector, acknowledging that much of the work gets done by volunteers, that are versed in marketing, nor do they really want to become marketers or learn about marketing. The closest we come are fundraisers. And even though those disciplines are certainly related, they are different. And so where does that land us? That lands us in a place where you have these organizations that are doing the most important work on the planet, the highest impact work in so many ways. And there is a disconnect between the awesomeness of the work and the awesomeness of the marketing, and in particular, the awesomeness of the messaging. And if we're getting more granular, let's go down to the words that are used. So you mentioned that I had done some research. This research is now 5 years old. It's time to refresh it. So that's on the horizon. We wanted to give it enough time so that if we were doing longitudinal analysis, we would, really see trends and not just little blips. But what we found, and what I would say anecdotally, I still find to be very true with the clients I work with, when they come to me, is that they're doing some very specific things, usually unbeknownst to them, that are undermining their ability to use language to create impact. And those things look like using, so in the English language, and I want to acknowledge this is a very US, Canada focused centric take on this. It could be different other places, although I speak a little bit of French, and so I've done a teeny bit of looking at that. And there was definitely some mirroring there. But in the English language in North America, well, I'll just say it this way. Organizations use 0.03% of the words available to them on average on their websites. And when you pair this with the fact that our brains as human beings love novelty, we love newness, and yet, nonprofits, at least on their websites, which for most people, that's an initial exposure point, are so boring, so vague, so watered down, so ho-hum, that potential donors, board members, supporters, funders come to them and are sort of like, right? Because we take the language as a reflection of the work. And so there are little things that organizations could do, right? Simply using what I refer to as a more expanded linguistic repertoire, just using more of the words that are available to you, is a great way to start. And yes, you need to balance this against, you don't want to get too flashy, and you don't want to be inauthentic, right? So this isn't an exercise in like picking shiny, great words just because you're like, oh, I love the word vexing, as a for instance, just for the sake of using it. So bringing that intentionality of, yes, you want people to be able to easily understand what you're talking about, and you want to just drop in a few interesting words that they might not expect, right? Because what you're doing is kind of it's a hack. It's a word hack. And what it does is just perks up their brain automatically, like, oh, that's interesting. Let me learn more. So there's a lot of that happens. And then I mentioned the word watered down. That's important. And I want to talk about why that happens, because it actually comes from a really, really beautiful place. So I want to honor the place that this comes from, and then maybe offer an alternative to it. The beautiful place that watered down, boring language comes from, for most organizations, is because people care so deeply about the work that they want to engage as many people as possible. And so there's a hesitancy in really speaking boldly and passionately to what you stand for and what you're doing and who you're serving, because you're afraid of offending people, right? The hypothesis here is if we can appeal to as many people as possible, then we'll get as many people engaged. And that's just not how marketing works. I mean, one, not everyone's going to be into what you're doing. They're just really not. And so instead, what happens is the people who really might be intrigued and interested in engaging with you are kind of turned off because it's just so boring. So I would say those are the two big ticket items that come to mind when I think about opportunity and kind of low level opportunity for organizations. who want to use words to greater effect.
Right. So that's a very interesting analysis. Do you feel like maybe a lot of times people don't want to sort of, just take the easiest path around, and they don't want to just go beyond the level of using words, which maybe they need to be more diligent to do more research and come out with words? Do you think that could be also one of the reasons?
Sure is that they don't want to be diligent. I actually have, I could think of almost no examples of that. What I find almost everywhere I go, whether or not I'm consulting, coaching, speaking, whatever, is a lack of bandwidth to do it. It's not a lack of volition. It is, an unsureness about which words will be the quote unquote right words. And also, nonprofits are just running on such thin margins. So time is at a premium. And if it's between serving a couple more people and, messing with your messaging, I think, the default is going to be to serve more people, which makes total sense. And it's really hard, especially now with how many people and how much they're hurting, to convince yourself and to see like, okay, if we can just take a little time now to more clearly, more compellingly communicate what we do, that's going to pay dividends down the road. And it does. Every time it does. But there's an opportunity cost to that. And sometimes the near-term, short-term opportunity cost just feels too painful to make the investment of time, and sometimes money, and certainly energy.
Now, based on Giving USA report, now you look at philanthropy in the US, so it hovers around 2% of the GDP, and this is spread out over decades. Now, this is based on an article, 8 Myths of US Philanthropy, published in Stanford Social Innovation Review. I also understand you have, I read your article also, and we'll also come to that question. But here the question is like, how do you think that the messaging could increase the giving pie in the in America as a percentage of the GDP? It's looking at 2%. Do you think that could change?
I love that you're asking this question. I love that you're surfacing that giving, every year when the Giving USA report comes out, people are like, and the amount of giving is up, and it is up in terms of sheer dollars year over year. And here I want to pause and say that generosity is astonishing, and it's to be honored. And by the same token, when we look at those exact same numbers, as you're pointing out, as a percent of GDP, it hovers at 2%. And for the life of us in the US, we can't get past that. So, the researcher in me always hesitates to sort of posit what would get us past that, because that's like a gajillion-dollar question, literally. Like if we could go from 2 to 3% of GDP, that is game-changing for the sector, and we have not been able to do that. My hypothesis, based on the number of organizations that I've worked with and the success that they've had in attracting resources, because, at least in part, because of the ability to better communicate, using better words, the language, all of those things, it makes a difference. And so, this honestly, Nishant, is why I created Claxon University. It was because I, as a consultant, and especially I wear multiple hats, so, including being a professor at University of Washington. So I can only work with so many organizations, but everything I do, for the most part, is learnable. And, that price point, the consulting price point is out of touch for a lot of organizations. Also, well, this is a little less true now, but most of the organizations I work with are going to be in the United States. And, you're in India, like there's just all over the world, there are organizations that want to do better with this and can, just by learning a couple techniques. Even the Claxon Method, which is so simple, right? It's simply a matter of saying, what does success look like? Who do we need to engage? Who's our target audience? And then how are we going to do it? If organizations just made that switch every single time you're talking about marketing, what does success look like? Who's our target audience? How are we going to reach them? Just that, game changer for organizations that are diligent about doing it. So that's my hypothesis, really. And that's, it's why I've invested in Claxon University. It's why I invest in the Claxon Method. It's why I invest in tools that are widely acceptable, because I live for this vision that there will be a day when any organization that wants to make the world a better place is like, oh, well, of course we're going to learn how to do our messaging, and we know that we can do that, and that it's within reach, that it's accessible. we would have to try it at scale. And I'm certainly not willing to say that I've done it at scale, but I do feel confident that I've done it with enough organizations to say if we did it at scale, I think that we could have take a passing shot at getting past the 2% ceiling.
I think the Claxon University is a very exciting idea. I did check it up and I found it to be very refreshing. And I'm sure this is going to have a huge impact, because like not only in the US, so you could spread out to anywhere in the world and, people can get the best practices, specifically in nonprofits. That's going to help. Not only.
Well, I appreciate using the term refreshing. People, I try to use a lot of humor. And it's one, I just, I like laughing. So I try to infuse it wherever I can. But also people learn better when they're smiling. Yeah, so it's intentional.
I was talking to Larry last time, and he was also speaking about how fundraising is going to be in the US. Now, do you think I also read a report, and I feel like presently there's not going to be much change in philanthropy and giving. And specifically in the healthcare sector, it's very obvious, like they'll be sort of raising a lot more fund. It's going to go up. Right. But do you think the dynamics of giving are going to change post the COVID, post the pandemic?
I want to say yes. The closest comparison we have to what we're living through, or most recent comparison, would be the 2008 financial crisis. However, I think we can all acknowledge that what we're living through now is like nothing compared to 2008, right? So are there lessons to be learned there? Probably. Did giving change after that in some ways? Will we see those trends again? I just don't know. I mean, what we were just talking about before is 2% of GDP as being 2% of GDP. So, I mean, there's nothing historically to suggest it, except that we are living in a historic moment. And so maybe this will be one of the things that comes out of it. It's sort of an acknowledgement of the shifts that need to happen. So I want to be optimistic, but even when I look at, and again, my viewpoint is so US centric, so I apologize for that to your listeners who have a much more international perspective, but when we're looking at stimulus bills in the United States, nonprofits have to advocate so loudly and point out, like, we need to be included in this. We're struggling so deeply. So my answer is, I don't know. I want to believe, yes, that, there's so much healthy disruption happening. So that's where I'm hoping we're going to end up. But history would not suggest that's what's going to happen.
There's a lot of positive disruption happening and things could change. But still, America is, I think, on the leaders, 2% of the GDP. I think UK, America are still, in terms of total amount of, I'm not looking at a percentage of the GDP, but in terms of absolute terms, I think America still leads in giving around the world. Now, you also published an article at SSIR, right? You emphasize the importance of linguistic words coming in as a part of official communication for nonprofits. Now, as per your article, research has shown that the words that are used less often make a much more measurable impact in the audience. Like, for example, you used a word like use of verbs or betters. And, I also sort of, after you're reading your book, I realized it and I've made it now as a policy that I'll start using words which are a bit uncommon, so I've started looking up. I've made it a practice that I use like betters the life of people. Yeah. So do elaborate your thoughts here, because, this is something which is very interesting, very unique. When I read that, I was really impressed and I thought, okay, this is something I never thought about. I never even thought that words could make such a huge impact. So that is something like totally out of the box.
Thank you. It's funny, I live and breathe it. So I'm like, well, of course you would think about verbs first. Why wouldn't you? So I mentioned in a previous answer, so I don't want to necessarily go over the territory again, but linguistic repertoire is like, how many words are you using? So you mentioned two other things that I think are so important, and partly they're important and they get me so excited because it's so easy. Like once you see it, you're like, how did I not see it? And by the way, most adults go through, European and North American adults go through about 15,000 words a day. So sort of the question that I always invite people to think about is like, what can we co-opt to increase our impact? Like, how many of those words can we co-opt? And if we're going through 15,000 words a day, how can we make the best use of them? Right. So it's not like more words. In fact, oftentimes it's less words. A lot of the work I do with organizations is pruning. It's like you were saying too many things. Like, really, if you tell people you're everything, they remember nothing. So we want to get you down to the essence of what you're talking about. And I do have an unusual approach in that I don't want organizations to write full sentences first. What I really encourage is that you pick your verbs first. So verbs are action words, right? And this is, particular to English. There's some variation by different languages. So you should tell me how this plays out in other languages. If you pick your verb first, it is so much more concrete. It's so much more tangible. And then you build the sentence around it, right? Your verbs, your action words, especially in your mission, your vision, and your purpose statements, that's really like the commitment that you're making. And that's the flag you're waving and saying, this is how, action words, this is how we're going to make the world a better place. If you sit down with a group of super, ambitious in the best sense of the word, people who want to make the world a better place, and you're like, let's do your messaging, and they start writing, it's too much. And you end up with, that's how you end up with kind of boring language. If you break it down by part of speech, first verbs, then nouns, then adjectives, then do we want adverbs? On occasion, an adverb can really, be fantastic. What you end up with, like you deconstruct to reconstruct to greater effect. But that's it's a very out of the box, uncommon approach. And I just sort of stumbled upon it in some ways because I'd worked with so many organizations and found that when I facilitated them through the conversations, if we broke it down, they ended up with more compelling messaging. But there's another piece to this, which I think is really important to point out and just sort of pull out, which is, for people who really care about what they're doing. They care about the words. And if you invite them into the process, they're going to have a lot of opinions. So if it's a free-for-all, that undermines where you're going. But when they are invited in very specific ways, right? So up front you say, we want your input, and the decisions are going to be made by this much smaller group, right? Because we don't want messaging by committee. But we want to hear from you. We want to hear from you up front. We want to hear which 3 adjectives you would use to describe this organization. We want to hear the nouns you would use to describe our values. We want to hear about the verb. Invite them in there. And then I have been heard. I am a part of this. Whereas if a small committee goes away and just sort of develops the messaging and comes back and they're like, ta-da, new messaging, people are going to be like, whoa, what? Because what you are literally doing is giving voice to the work. So, you got to really take that to heart. You're giving voice to the work, and for people who care about the work, that's going to matter. It's one of those contextual things that is different in the development sector, I would say, as opposed to, in the private sector. In spaces in the private sector that aren't as concerned with making the world a better place.
So something just popped up, popped into my head right now when you're speaking. You spoke that you stumbled upon, you talked to a lot of nonprofits. Was there any particular incident which brought you to this? I would say, won't you say the sort of work which you've done was a bit of a esoteric, was something which is usually just trying to now cope up with your arsenal of words, but I would say something must have happened. Did you see, what was this analysis? Was there something behavioral aspects which you saw which sort of said, okay, let's look at this particular line of thinking?
I'm chuckling because, we haven't even talked about my theories about applying universal laws of physics to language, the energetics of language. You can get real esoteric real quick. I try to bring it back down. What was happening was, way back when, I was mainly hired as a writer. People had stuff that they needed written, and so they'd reach out because I was mainly known as a writer. And what I kept seeing was like, I could come up with some good copy, I could come up with some good content. And some, for the most part, they'd be kind of sort of happy with it. or really happy with it. But there was always this lingering, like it wasn't theirs. So I think for me, it was partly a philosophical, a principle of sorts that was like, these shouldn't be my words. I'm not the one doing the work. And especially as a consultant, I am not the one doing the work. My job is to help you find the words, right? So when I made that shift and sort of committed to, I'm going to help organizations find the words, then I was left with like, well, how am I going to help them do that, right? And that's when I got more rigorous. And in terms of sequencing, that's when I developed the Claxon Method, because it allowed me to ask a series of questions. And when we got to how are we going to do it, sometimes they would find the word, sometimes I would. I started to do much more like this or this or this, as opposed to like, and this is what it should be. And so it was the Claxon Method that came. Then it was that tool, the 1, 2, 3 marketing tree, which is like a marketing strategy tool, but it's really visual. It's a poster size tool, so you can really interact with it. And then I started noticing, mainly through facilitation, this piece around people needing to be involved in the process in a very specific way in order for the language to be used. But, the larger the organization, your odds go down that the new language is actually going to be used, because as people, we crave progress and we resist change. And you're asking people to change. You're asking people to change the language they're using, right? So this is a big ask. And that's how I started, it was sort of like this sentence or this sentence, this sentence or this sentence. And then I was like, I'm not even going to go to the sentence level. It needs to be a unit down from that, because then you're comparing too many things. Like if you're comparing entire sentences with a group, you have to think each of those words, is a unit of measurement. So, quickly it can devolve into like, let's swap this and this, then you have a Frankenstein sentence. So that's how I came upon the, like, we're going to deconstruct before we reconstruct. And that's how I got to like comparing verbs. If you're comparing one unit, it's 1 unit of measurement. It's 1 unit of measurement, it's 1 unit of measurement. And then we can put it back together. So it was just a series of things like that. There weren't any moments that, I'm trying to think back, but it really was more iterative. It was organic. But it did come from that commitment of like, it's not for me to say, these are your words. This is your work, but I would love to help you find them.
Okay. I think change is always, it's iterative and it keeps going. And I like you use the word, people resist change. And one of the is enabling social change and impact, resisted, but many times it's always fantastic to have.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious about enabling. That's a very interesting verb to me. It's a very controversial verb. It's like empowering.
How did I just was thinking what to sort of think. I was maybe enabling word is something which kept on coming in my mind, that is something which I would like to do, which is, I thought, reflects also it's more sustainable, that it's not a short-term change which you're looking at, but this change should be sustainable, done for social impact. I talk about change. How about enabling social change and impact? That's all. It was maybe came up at home. I don't know how it came in, but somehow that word has stuck in, and I've then started using it in almost all of my publications. Right, and so you think it's a good something which is you'll say in the positive side would be using it?
Well, here's the thing with enabling. So it can be seen as passive.
Okay.
So, and again, this is where like, I'm just going to offer perspective, food for thought. And you might have already thought about these things. Whereas something like facilitating social change and impact would be slightly more active. So I think, it depends on kind of what relationship do you want to own in terms of your role vis-a-vis the social change and impact. And the corollary to the word empowering is, there's a question mark about, can an external force empower something that is naturally intrinsic, right? So can a nonprofit empower youth or empower women or empower whatever? And we see the word empower a lot in the development sector. And what I say to organizations that are drawn to that word, because again, it's their words, right? They need to resonate with the people of the organization and their external supporters. A lot of my job is that, I think of like, I'm a 3-year-old, why? why? And then we just keep asking why. And like, what do you think? So that would be my question is, and I don't know enough about the work that Middle Ground does, Middle Road does, but is it passive or is it more active? Would be a line of questioning that would be worth pursuing.
Since you have talked about the tagline, this is a good example. We can use the tagline, and you also have your book published, Pitchfalls: Why Bad Pitches Happen to Good People. It's a very interesting read. How would you? So there you have talked about quite a few. You have your own structure. So take an example. Now you take the tagline, or you could take any example, and give us how it can be better represented as a pitch to investors. That's one of the. You could take this example or any example, whichever you would like to share with the audience.
Well, okay, so let's just point a couple things out. Taglines are meant to be read, not said.
Okay.
So if you're pitching to an investor, usually you would be saying it. So your tagline, you want it to complement your other messaging, your pitch, but it might not be the same thing. So I always like to sort of point that out, because sometimes people try to make their taglines do really funky things. And then, and actually oftentimes it's not uncommon. Organizations will be like, yeah, we came up with a tagline. We love it. And now our messaging, and this will be your elevator pitch. And I talk about this in the book, like it's pretty easy to sound like a robot because the way we write is oftentimes different than the way we speak. It's more formal. And the other thing about, I was just having this conversation with a client earlier, actually a couple of days ago and earlier today even, like, do taglines need a verb? A lot of taglines don't have a verb. And all of that's okay. It really does matter. Like, you can never think about one element of your messaging in isolation, really. You want to think about them as elements that work together. Right. And so how are they going to come together in different contexts to complement each other and to compensate? Right. So that same client, actually, their name is an acronym that, like, it's not an acronym that adds up to anything. Right. It's not clever like that. So they need a tagline of sorts that really says, this is what this program does. So, again, just being like super duper clear about what the job of each of the messaging elements is. I actually sometimes have organizations write job descriptions, for the tagline. So just continue with that example. The job description for that tagline is to instantly tell a reader or listener what the name of the organization or the program means, like to give it context, because there isn't any absent that. But if you have, if you're an organization that has a really a name that makes sense, your tagline has a different job, right? Your tagline the job of your tagline might be to speak about the why or the what or the who or something else that isn't in the name. And it's actually that conversation for folks. I like to have that before we even get to the verbs or anything else. It's like, what's the job? What's the job? What's the job? What's the job? So anyway, I was just going back to, because we were talking about enabling, and looking up, oftentimes I spend a lot of time looking at synonyms, right? Just to see if, like, swapping in, swapping out, what's gonna feel right. And I do, most of us do messaging this work, from our head. I really encourage organizations, this has to come from leadership, by the way, to trust their gut. And when you get to the right combination of words, you will feel it, because it'll feel like relief and it'll feel like exciting. And you'll go like, yeah, that's it. And that I have seen again and again and again. And every time I say it, people are like, I'm not going to trust my gut. It's just my gut. And what I point out is your gut actually is an accumulation of a whole bunch of data points that have gotten into your gut through your lived experience and that of the people that you're developing messaging with. It is actually data. We just discount it. We discount it a lot. But when it comes to these top level messaging elements, listen to it. And listen to it if it's like, boop, 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 like, that's not the thing. Listen to that equally. Listen to it equally. But that's kind of honestly, that's some of the work that I do is not super exciting. It's a lot of when, one of our clients is like, let's look at some synonyms. And is that what you really mean? And, I do. And I also look at, spend a lot of time in etymology. So looking at the history of a word, because that can give a lot of insight into, like, oh, that's where it came from, which is just sort of, interesting. Also can give you like, oh, that's not exactly what I mean. So those are some directions that I go in and some specific things that I do when I'm thinking about taglines. What's their job?
Yeah, but like, for example, you could give an example where people could, have a much better understanding using any tagline. And how I read your book. So basically, whenever you're talking to you're pitching to investors, it would be a lot bigger than what your tagline is. For example, anything change within this particular sector, that is how it would go in, right?
Oh, okay. Okay. I think what you're asking is, where does your tagline fit into a bigger pitch to investors, maybe? Oh, sorry, did not understand the question. This is why I should try to do a better job with clarifying questions. Yeah, I mean, your tagline really, the way it would fit in is they would see it, maybe it's the materials you sent in advance. It's relatively unusual, because we speak differently than we write, that you would say it, unless it were the case, I've seen some pitches say, our tagline says it all. And then you're going to go usually into, if it's a more formal stand and deliver, what I refer to, pitch, vision, this is the vision of the better world that we're seeing and that we're working towards, right? So in my construct, you have values, brand, personality, but then you have vision, purpose, and mission. And your vision is, where are you going and why? Like, why do we want to work towards that vision of a better world? Your purpose is, why is our organization or our team or whatever program, why are we needed? Why do we exist? Like, what makes us unique in this space and uniquely able to work towards that vision? And then your mission is actually the what, who, how. Right? That's like, here's how we're doing it. That's what brings your purpose to life. So it's going to be some combination of those things up front. And then part of the pitching is really knowing your audience, right? So from there, it's sort of challenging to give examples because it's so individualized. So I can give an example. There's an organization called Global Impact. They have the very wonderful URL of charity.org, by the way.
Okay, great. There's another question, whether somebody should have such a generic URL. I think it's really good. Maybe as a brand, no, but just put charity and you are right there.
Yeah, charity.org. I mean, so this was actually a very interesting conversation, and Scott Jackson, their executive director, and I've talked about this publicly, so I feel like I can talk about it, which was, do they keep it or not? Because the name of the organization is Global Impact, right? So it's not charity.org. However, when we look to the research, and they have an international audience, and in addition to domestic, they work internationally, and charity is used so much more often than philanthropy. And they had a fair amount of equity in it, right? So they made the choice to stick with it. And then their tagline actually is charitable ventures for greater giving. Okay. So I think to your question about how this would fit in, this tagline serves them. And I've heard Scott use this, and he says, our tagline kind of says it all. What we're about is creating and cultivating charitable ventures that will apply greater giving. So he can bring these 5 words to life. And then it's a matter of customizing from there. So, and, folks can go on their website and kind of see how the other elements play out. But I think that they're a good example of how tagline can really take you far. And also, they internally really had to through a lot of stuff, a lot of resistance. I'm sure there's still people who are like, I don't know. But eventually folks were like, no, that actually does speak very directly to what we do. And the greater giving is the why. I mean, that's why they do it. So it's kind of both the what and the why. It's a hard-working tagline.
Okay. Now, you have mentioned 5 steps for a good pitch, the book which I just discussed about. Would you like to share any detailed example from the industry on how to implement them in real life?
Not steps so much as tips. Right? So not everyone will do these things. That's why I call them pitfalls. So rather than like the Claxon Method has 3 steps, these are 3 potential pitfalls. So number 1 would be you sound like a robot, which we've talked about and happens most often with the tagline. The number 2 is you only talk about yourself. So this is an interesting one right now, because there's a very active discussion, at least in the United States and in Canada, about who should be the hero of your marketing if you're a nonprofit. And oftentimes we make the donor the hero. And now there's really there's a movement called community-centric fundraising, which is it should be the people you serve. But in no instance, should the organization be the hero, right? So you need to get yourself out of there. You talk too much. Again, I've mentioned this a little bit, but going on and on and on and on comes from a beautiful place. And you really want to speak to the essence and not the everything. For sequencing, I mean, in the book I talk about sequencing can really help with that, and being clear that like you'll get there, but first we're going to talk about this, and then next we're going to talk about this. We haven't talked about jargon. That's number 4. And then number 5 is you sound like a talking tagline, which I feel like we've covered. So what I want listeners to hear is you probably don't do all of these things. I mean, you may, but most organizations will read them and be like, oh, we do 2 and 4. And so that's where you want to focus your energy. I do want to talk about jargon. It happens so frequently. This isn't unique to the development sector, by the way. We all fall prey to using jargon. And the issue with jargon is that unless you know for sure that your listener or reader knows what you're talking about, they will feel excluded, or they risk feeling excluded. And if what you were trying to do is use language to engage people, you've just done the opposite. So it is worth it to be diligent about trying to use as little jargon as possible. Especially the you only talk about yourself one, because this is, I mean, the workaround on this is to work the word you, Y-O-U, into your sentences, especially your initial sentences. So an example, the before example would be, well, way back, it's, I teach, we make it easy for people to get where they want to go. Okay. After, we make it easy for you to get where you want to go.
Including everybody, that's what it is. It's
including everybody, and actually it has to do with our reticular activating systems in our brains. We have a very hard time ignoring the term you, especially in this type of context. So it's a you or your. Just another quick example, we build eco-friendly housing. We build eco-friendly homes. Again, difference between housing and homes for people like you and your family. So there's a whole bunch of, just really, like I said, none of what I do is really rocket science. It is really sort of a big combination of doing a whole bunch of little things a little bit differently. And that's why I say everybody can do this. This is so doable. I hope all listeners listen and like pick one thing. You're not going to, like, they've been pummeled with a whole bunch of ideas. Pick one thing. Decide, like you did, that you're going to focus on your verbs. Decide you're not going to use jargon. Pick one to start with. It's too much to do it all at once. Change over time.
I know you're also a podcast host, so that question is obviously going to come in because podcast is a part, but I saw you're very passionate about teaching. You're very passionate about Claxon University, and online education is also a huge aspect of the middle road. I mean, I myself make all the, this is across different topics like macroeconomics, statistics, impact. Now, I looked at your site, and you're very impact focused. For example, you have given a description how much people could have increased their fundraising after attending your courses. Would like to speak, and this is totally up to what you want to speak about your venture, because I thought I should give you a floor and get your views on how do you see not only online teaching as evolving over a period of time, specifically the COVID, but you could speak anything about a venture which excites
you. This is such an interesting time for teaching. I teach, and I had created Claxon University, but I created Claxon University really assuming that people will go through it on their own. Then what we experienced starting last year was we're still going to teach it. You're still going to have an instructor, but now we're all remote. That was pretty bumpy. I mean, I would say on balance that was bumpy, and that we're improving. I think a big, a big question mark and something where I see great potential is for folks who have gone through that experience, being able to see the ways in which you could bring more of the world to your classroom is exciting, right? So as an example, I try to bring in a lot of guests into my classroom. Now, when pre-COVID, I always wanted them to come in person. Well, so that means they're going to need to be kind of in the greater Seattle area. So one of my big takeaways is like, that doesn't need to be the case anymore, right? Like I should be thinking about who is the very best person on the planet that's willing to come and join my class. And if they're in Seattle, great. And if they're not, then can I invite them, right? And then they would join us virtually. And every instructor is different, right? So that I was just talking to a colleague about that. Part of what I view part of my job as a professor as, yes, teaching content, but also creating connection to ideas, creating connection to people. So if I can do a better job on the connection side of things, that's super exciting for me. It's just a big question mark though. Like, will we go back to all in person? Will we have realized that some courses lend themselves more naturally to online? And then the other thing is, I hope that we're going to have increased access. When we look at virtual events, if we're talking about the development sector and nonprofits, I mean, they have had to transition to online events. And the one thing that I hear in conferences, if you think about conferences, I would say a bright spot that I'm hearing super consistently is, in the end, we could serve more people. So again, Washington State, I sit on the host committee for our Washington State Nonprofit Conference, which our state association, Washington Nonprofits, puts on every year. So we were just having a meeting, and one of the beautiful things from last year was we're a state that has an urban sort of corridor, but a lot of this state is rural. And so getting to the greater Seattle area was out of reach. They were able to serve so many more rural organizations who just really want access to the information. So there are some bright spots that are coming out of it. Back in the classroom. Not being able to meet my students in person has been hard. They're so amazing. They never cease to inspire and amaze me. I learn way more from them than they will learn from me every time. So I miss the human interaction. I miss that in person, but that maybe you create a deeper and broader connections. I'm excited about that.
That's very interesting, Tate. As a podcast, you're a podcast host. What are the key attributes you think are important to make somebody an excellent? I understand you're and you should be very animated. You have a great sense of humor. So I can clearly see that you would be a fantastic podcast host. But would you like to share your thoughts? Say, what do you think? Some of the things which you think are important when you are in the podcast world.
I can only speak for myself and sort of very subjectively what I'm drawn to in other podcast hosts. I would say really care about your topic, know your topic, and be super curious. I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but my podcast is Marketing for Good, and the whole thing is, I truly think marketing can be a force for good in the world. I do, but we've kind of blown it historically with marketing in a lot of ways. It has perpetuated a whole bunch of terrible things around racism and sexism and body image issues and just a pile of yuckiness. What would the world look like if that wasn't the case? What would it look like? And I can be forever curious about that, and I'm never going to quit caring about it. I just am not. So I don't have the stats handy. You might know them more than me. About how many podcasts die after like 10 episodes and then 20 and 25. And, it's a thing. Like, it's a thing to keep it going. So I think you definitely have to be passionate about it, and also be clear about how it's supporting whatever it's meant to support. So if it's meant to support your business, act accordingly, And I'll just speak candidly. When I first started, I was clear on kind of what I wanted the podcast to do. And I interviewed a whole bunch of really wonderful, fascinating, and my curiosity sometimes gets the best of me. So I think it sort of worked out because I'm curious and there were great people. but it's supposed to support Claxon, which does consulting and speaking. I mean, that's how Claxon makes money. And also I wanted it to invite more people to do Claxon University. About 20 episodes in, I was like, this is great. Super interesting humans. And it's not like we were off topic or something, but it wasn't necessarily, the content wasn't in line with my business goals. So, and I would say have grace a little bit. Like, I didn't know that out of the gate. You kind of got to do it, and you have to figure out where your rhythm is. And then also I got feedback. I did a couple solo shows early on, and then it was almost all interviews. And I started getting feedback from listeners that are like, I would like you to do more solo episodes. And those are, it's kind of me riffing, but also lecturing, and it's much more content focused. And so I listen to feedback. But I think caring and curiosity, that's what it comes down to, really.
But it also helps you. I mean, it might not be, it could be like a side business going to be promoting your work, but
yeah, that's fair. That's really fair, Nishant. That's fair. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, yeah, you're totally right. If it's a side hustle and you're just doing it for fun, that's great. I would still say, though, you better be really interested in your topic. Right? Just be real interested in your topic. Yeah, I think I would love to see more folks in the development sector do podcasting. I think it has great potential. It's like blogging 10 years ago. It's more personal in a lot of ways, which is, you're in people's ears. So that's personal.
And but it's maybe also going big in the US, at least like that's from whatever I know, that's one particular sector which people are like looking at very closely.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, you already told me what excites you about the whole experience. Now we come to the final question is like, of course, you like to share an aha moment from your life, or it could be multiple experiences you like to share, and also give a message. And also I want to also be very sure, for example, I'm a social entrepreneur. I'm not exactly a non-profit, so I'm a for-profit social entrepreneur, but I feel like your messaging is so important to me, or a lot of social entrepreneurs who are coming in. And this is a hotly debated topic. I mean, when I was in Ford School, we had a very specific class, and we had this topic that whether people should be a social entrepreneur or it's like totally you have to be a non-profit. And there's always a blurring edge, or there are always overlaps between the two. But I feel like your message is so true for all organizations. It need not be just for non-profit. It could be for profit. It could be just for a business which is trying to make a change, or trying to be in sectors which could help humanity or society. Now, looking at that, you share a message with everybody, whatever you want to share in. And but before that, of course, aha moments.
Aha moments from my life or my professional life?
It could be from anywhere. Whatever you feel you want to share with the audience, it's up to you. It could be from your personal life, or it could be also from before. It could be from both. As a matter of fact, that's something will be very interesting, how your personal life, and so it'll be good if you could get it from both of them.
Let me address one thing that you raised. So, nonprofit, social entrepreneur, it's just a tech status. It's just a tech status. And so do you have to be a nonprofit? No, you don't. And in fact, so I teach an undergrad course on nonprofits, philanthropy, and social innovation. And we talk a lot about, leading with what's the impact that you want to have, and then reverse engineering into, okay, this is the container. This is the legal status. And this is the business plan. This is the finance plan that's most going to support the impact I want to have in the world. And the lines used to be much brighter, right? There was the nonprofit sector and the public sector and the private sector. I think one of those things that's happening is those lines are blurring, and that makes a lot of people uncomfortable because we like black and white and tidy things. That's not where we're at right now in terms of impact. And social entrepreneurs, I mean, there's just endless examples. I mean, you're a shining example. Claxon, I consider Claxon to be a social enterprise, right? Like, I absolutely want to have impact. I absolutely want to make the world a better place. And we happen to be an LLC. I mean, one of the challenges, so I also teach a course on marketing for good, or marketing for social impact, at the graduate level. And they, one of the early challenges I give them, because most of them are kind of looking at the nonprofit space, so I challenge them to not use the word nonprofit for a week. Right?
Yep.
When do you miss it? How do you miss it? Because it's a little bit code for something, but code isn't interpreted by people in the same way, right? And so, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but most social enterprises don't say, well, I'm an LLC, or, I'm a C Corp, or I'm a whatever. That's just a tax status, right? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? So I couldn't agree more. Like everything I do, it doesn't, I work with for-profit companies. I work with their CSR departments. I work with their philanthropy departments. I work with the overall organization. It's just tax status. It's about intent. It really is about intent. I mean, words are agnostic. They don't know, right? They don't know to what they are in service to. So I could not agree more with that. I would offer, so I've had Claxon for almost 17 years. And my daughter is 16 and a half. And I pretty intentionally, I knew, I didn't know what shape it would take, but when I had her, there was a turning point where I was like, I'd really like to be more available, more present. Now this has trade-offs. I mean, I work a lot. I was, I was working with the Gates Foundation. I had a project with the Gates Foundation at the time, and PATH, which is a global health organization based out of Seattle at Global. And, I was working 3 days after giving birth. Do I recommend that? Absolutely not. No. But the long tail of that is I've worked from home for the most part. And so I've gotten to be available to my kids and present in a way that's been really wonderful and sometimes very stressful. When the door is closed, the door is closed. Why are you opening the door? So there's things like that. And I guess I mention it because I feel like your listeners, lots of people are drawn to this work because they want to do things differently. I think that's one example for me of doing things differently. I wear many hats, and I've really taken to thinking of my work, which I feel just so blessed to do on every level, as a portfolio, right? And my portfolio shifts. So I'm attentive to what's in the portfolio. Sometimes that's a lot of consulting. Sometimes it's a lot of speaking. Sometimes it's a lot of teaching. Sometimes it's a lot of research, right? And that, just like a financial or investment portfolio, it's going to shift over time based on life cycle, horizon, what you want it to be, your values. And I think entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, I consider nonprofit leaders to be social entrepreneurs, right? We don't fit tidily into a box. And that can be kind of stressful. And so, and I had to really come to grips with this. And there was a lot of wrestling that happened before I got to a place of peace around, I have a really blessed portfolio of things. And the shape it takes allows me to have more time with my family, even during COVID, So I guess it's just an invitation that was an aha for me. You don't have to have a thing. You don't have to fit into a box. And as social entrepreneurs, that's tougher.
Maybe this could be the defining line in maybe after a decade. I mean, the way we are moving, the way this moment has come from Generation X and millennials. I mean, it could be that there would be a mindset change, and I think Americans should lead it, is that businesses would be now doing not only making a profit. That's not the ultimate aim, which is taught in business schools. It's like doing good and making a profit. I think
what, millennials and Gen Z, they are having none of this idea that it's only about profit. They expect, to a great extent, and I get that, I'm getting this from my students and also research, right? It's like they are drawn to, when they are in the interview, they're like, how are you making the world a better place? How does this align with the company values? Do my values align with your values? Oh, no? Okay, I'm not in. This is how they, consumers, 82% of consumers would, on balance, prefer to purchase from a company, a product or service that is also making the world a better place. Now, your quality, quality is supposed to be on par. They're not going to, necessarily subpar product just because of that. This is happening. And I think, I really feel like companies that don't get on board with this genuinely get on board with this. Genuinely, not just like smearing some social good on things with like a statement or something. Really starting to bake it into the culture, to bake it into the DNA of the organization. If they don't do it, they will miss out on top talent. 100%. And I don't mean top talent just in terms of like intellectual, like the most awesome people, whatever awesome needs to look like for your company to be successful, right? That doesn't need to be a 4.0. I mean, I always feel like I kind of have to have a caveat because I'm a professor, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. Just, do you want the most awesome people? You better get on board.
That's true. But coming back to aha moment, which would anything to share? And I think this is sort of.
I thought about this so much, and I'm like, am I defective? Do I just not have a lot of aha moments in my life? Those are my two, really. Was my aha moment that I wanted to construct my professional life so it complemented my personal life, so I could take advantage of what turns out to be a very narrow. It's like a teeny window of time when your kids are at home with you, and then they're gone. And by the time they're teenagers, they're gone. And just as they start driving, they're gone. That was an aha for me because, I was lucky. My dad, worked, he was a professor and then he became a consultant back in the 80s, worked from home before anybody did that. I mean, that was like very unusual. So I had some precedent, but I still felt pretty drawn to the traditional, career path. I would offer to social entrepreneurs another aha moment, which came relatively early when I was doing, but maybe not really, not as early as I would like. I wish it had been out of the gate. Was that your no's are more as important as your yeses? I think we tend, especially if you're just starting out, don't say yes to everything. It's hard to do. Like the practical perspective is the stuff you say yes to, if you're good at it, that's what you're going to get referred to. So it's not what you want to be doing. You're going to get referred to work that you don't want to be doing. And it's pretty, it's tough to be like, I know I've done that work, but it's not the work that I want to be known for. Get clear what you want to be known for. And that, that was, an aha moment was realizing that because Claxon's gone through iterations, and prior to it was Mills Communications Group. And we were like a full service marketing firm. We built websites, we put on events, we did all the everything. And then I realized the thing that my clients valued most was the language, the words that came out of those things. And I looked around and was like, well, nobody's seriously obsessing about this. So it made it easier to become known as the sort of messaging magician, the obsessed word woman. So, be clear on what you want to be known for and decline, say no. Don't say yes just because you feel like you have to. And I don't know, that can be tough when you're starting out. Cash flow being what it is and all of that. I would say the other aha that I feel like I really have to say as a white woman in the past year, realizing how much privilege I have experienced simply because of the color of my skin. Humbling. Very humbling. Yeah. So that's, I try to honor that every day and in a lot of different ways. I am able to do many of the things I am, not because I earned the privilege to do it, but because it was unearned because of the color of my skin. And I think there are a lot of white folks, and I'm hoping this becomes a norm. They're now getting that. And once you get it, it's humbling. Actually, the podcast that Marketing for Good just put out was an interview with an anti-racist scholar and educator about how you can integrate anti-racism into your messaging. Those conversations weren't happening 18 months ago, pretty much at all in a white space. So that was an aha for me. And I'm a work in progress on that for sure. I definitely get it wrong often. But just to have that awareness was a big aha.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. That was a very poignant message, and this straight from the heart. You shared a lot from everywhere. We got experiences from your different parts of work which you're doing. So thank you for coming to the middle road.
Thank you for inviting me to the middle road. Thank you for the work you're doing. It's important. It's inspiring. And thanks for getting up so gosh darn early to have this conversation. Yeah.
No, it's always my pleasure. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.